So if you're Trump, you see these NGOs as being very ideological, globalist, left wing, and also one that's tries to perpetuate the war in Ukraine. Defund them. And this is the main idea. And they're doing this. They're just defunding everything. Of course, there's an money issue here as well, as the US is obviously heading for bankruptcy, so they also needs to cut their cost.
Hello, everybody. I'm still talking to Glenn Diesen here, my friend and colleague from Norway. And now, in the second part of the interview, after we discussed what was going on in Europe, we need to talk about one of the mechanisms with which the discourse in Europe has been and worldwide has been to a large part monopolized and also guided through the way of the propaganda network. And we learned that recently with the revelations about the funding of all of these NGOs all around the world, including in Europe, the funding that now is being revealed because Donald Trump is investigating his own the USAID, the aid agency, and other agencies of how they spend money, and we are learning that there is like millions and hundreds of millions going into different NGOs, and this also is channeled through the National Endowment for Democracy. And I want to discuss this with you, Glenn, because on the one hand you've been observing it for a long time, on the other hand you've been on the receiving end of this stick that the NGOs are wielding, even in Europe. Do you also see this as one of the mechanisms, the NGOs, through which narrative control and consent is being manufactured?
Yeah, of course. I think this is a key instrument of power. And again, we have economic power, military power, and then we have a fight for information in the media. But why would in this efforts to shape public opinion, why would somehow trying to influence the civil society of other countries for some reason be off the table? And of course, it is an interest to, if you can change the minds of the people in other countries, then this is yeah, this is an instrument of power, and this has been always been the case. And what is so shocking about this is not just what has been revealed, the extent of this influence. And as you said, this is to manufacture consent. Across the Western countries, it's we use the same NGOs here to manufacture consent, make sure that there's no real dissent against the main ideas. And in adversarial countries, we have efforts to we use the same NGOs for regime change. Now, what is a bit surprising is how much surprise there is because we kind of already knew this. All the evidence was already out. You mentioned the National Endowment for Democracy. This was set up by Reagan and the CIA director in the 1980s for this exact reason. There's been so many, leaked documents, declassified documents. You had CIA whistleblowers. You had the people who set up the National Endowment for Democracy, all confirming that, yeah, what and CIA used to do, we do, uh, and it makes a lot of sense. But it's also a very controversial topic. First of all, civil society is very important. This is what balances the state. That the government doesn't decide everything. That your role as a citizen, it's not just to vote every couple of years, but you should be able to yeah, engage more. But we made up this idea that these non-governmental organizations, they are civil society. They're the one who gets to represent civil society, which is a very strange thing to argue because suddenly a lot of power is vested now in the NGOs. If now we claim that NGOs are the one who gets to represent civil society and make it much worse, what if all the major NGOs are financed by government? What if they're staffed by people close to an intelligence community? And what if their interpretation of, for example, human rights always align with the geopolitical interest? So when you have issues, often bring up the Assange issue because often these NGOs, they see Julian Assange, oh, they don't care that much about what he reveals, but they spend a lot of time smearing him. So, you always have this. And again, this is not a conspiracy theory. We have all the evidence already. We know that they're financed almost completely by governments. We know from all these leaks that they have been staffed by people close to the intelligence community, that they've been working with the intelligence community, because they're a great instrument for manipulating civil society. They get to they become the main facilitator to organize civil society. And also they get to, instead of, having military leaders try to do it, they get to present themselves as altruistic. They are, they're there to support democracy, human rights. And as anyone who studies communication theory knows, it's how the message is received very much depends on who's delivering the message. If you are, if you claim to be an organization who just there to promote freedom, it's more likely that your messages will be accepted. If the CIA stands there handing out money to protesters, you know what's happening. If it's a non-governmental organization fighting for democracy, you have less yeah, there's not that voice in the back of your head that much who opposes this. So it has been a very big tool, and this is what we find out now as well when the US cut funding to USAID, and suddenly 85 to 90% of Ukrainian media no longer get their paychecks, and we see the political groups are not financed. We we see protesters suddenly not receiving their money. I mean, this is part of politics, and it should be addressed. But the beautiful part of these NGOs, if you criticize them, now you hate civil society. This is what I discovered. I criticized an article how the NGOs were hijacking civil society, and one of these NGOs actually wrote a letter to my university to explain them how dangerous I was because I actually undermine, I threaten civil society because I criticize them. I mean, it's absurd. It's
You, as a member
amazing.
of civil society, threaten civil society by criticizing it. Mm.
No, you have to
Again,
subordinate. You have to accept NGO. You rule as civil society,
yeah.
and this is a point of departure. If you don't accept that they represent civil society, then you're not allowed to speak anymore, and yeah, they will come for you. So
It's the same mindset that we talked about in the first part of the interview, right? It's like the equating of a higher good with yourself and then making everybody else believe that. Um, but I want to talk about your experiences too, but just a second, like because I have two more related questions. One question is, of course, why does the US itself now dismantle this tool of its own power, which has worked beautifully? I mean, like think about it from the perspective of the United States. This thing is responsible to convince a good enough people in Ukraine to actually be the sacrificial lamb, right? To go to the battlefield and fight a war that the Biden administration wanted to fight, right? This is a very, very powerful tool, and the US is dismantling it itself. Secondly, the the this tendency now of the media to actually still bemoan this. The Reporters Without Borders, a French organization, they complained that now so many journalists are not getting paid anymore because the U.S. is cutting this funding, and this is so horrible because independent journalism is so important. Not understanding. I mean, that post is still up. They equate being paid by NGOs and by US funded or EU, also EU funded in some parts, money with independent journalism. As in, they still don't understand that that is not independence. That's more or less the definition of being dependent on somebody. Can you speak to these two questions?
yeah, well, this is why it was referred to in the 80s when they set up these NGOs as hiding in plain sight. Because if American intelligence agencies give money to journalists, now you have a scandal. If the CIA sets up NGOs as an intermediary, the intelligence agencies still give money to the NGOs, and they work with the intelligence agency, and they give it to the journalist. Now it's okay. Now it's not a scandal anymore. Again, you can hide in plain sight. So, no, but this is something very, very, very crazy. That is, I've seen these headlines popping up everywhere, not just, yeah, this idea that, they're cutting money for independent media. But when you're being financed by the United States and organizations linked to its intelligence agencies, it's going to impact your reporting. And if it's not, not telling you what to do, at least it's limited who gets access to these funds. The people who ends up on their payroll, they are certain ideological positioning. And you see all of this independent medias they have in Ukraine, which 85, 90% have been financed. Well, they don't tend to report on necessarily realities on the battlefield. They don't report on yeah, the most very basic things are happening. For example, the shooting on Maidan. What's actually happening in the court, which would, been proving that it was the opposition groups who later took government who were behind the shooting. They don't address these issues because, well, why would you? That's not why you were hired. So I think this is. I think, but also why would the U.S. why would Trump cut it? Because as you said, they've been a very good instrument of power, and I think they became too ideological. And this is the problem when a society becomes polarized, because if if it's just an instrument for U.S. interest against the rest of the world, it's yeah, why would you cut it? But you also see now that some of the concern in the United States is as society polarizes, they see a lot of this that the USAID promoting a lot of woke projects. This is not something they like because that's some of the things that divide them internally. But it's also in terms of foreign policy interests, as we see now the Trump administration, they want to take the US in a different direction. They don't want to, they can't go after, Russia, China, everyone at the same time. So it's important to see how these NGOs are used. Not only have they been used in the color revolution. So if you look at Ukraine, for example, the NGOs had a very central role when they toppled the government in Ukraine in 2004. They also had an important role when they toppled the government in 2014. But also in any efforts to have peace, the NGOs are also very good at opposing this. Uh, as we spoke about earlier in 2019, they had a presidential election in Ukraine. As we remember, Zelensky ran on the peace platform. He was going to talk to Donbass, he actually have diplomacy. He was going to try to make peace with the Russians, and most of this was going to be achieved by implementing the Minsk agreement. But what happened? Well, we know the United States, of course, had all of this, right-wing fascist groups, which they had been financing, which threatened Zelensky's life if he would do this. Very open in the media, by the way. But we also had NGOs such as the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and they actually sent a letter, a warning to Zelensky. They said, as a civil society, because they're a civil society, we have a list of red lines not to be crossed. The first one of well, one of the important thing was well, I think the first one was don't hold a referendum on negotiations with the Russians, something along those lines. If you're gonna have if there's gonna be talk with Russia, it can't be done without the Western states. So again, this is the This is NGO financed by the Western states who are not permitting the Ukrainian government, who just won a landslide election, to actually negotiate without them or to hold a referendum on autonomy. You can't make any concession that might undermine our national interest, which is very vague. And they have, you can't even delay EU and NATO membership. So and also, yeah, don't implement any security policies which contradicts that of the former government. So all these strange things, which effectively translates into your whole election platform, the peace mandate you were given. If you try to actually implement this is a red line, and political stability will suffer as a result. This is more or less what the fascist groups, which the US financed as well, said, except they said that Zelensky would hang from a tree if he tried to implement the peace mandate, which he had won. So again, this is an NGO. They help to topple the government. Once the government is toppled, they're there to make sure that any election cannot reverse it, that there won't be any peace with Donbass, there will be no peace with Russia, and that the conflict will continue.
Yeah.
So this is so if you're Trump, you see these NGOs as being very ideological, globalist, left wing, and also one that's tries to perpetuate the war in Ukraine. Defund them. And this is the main idea. And they're doing this. They're just defunding everything. Of course, there's an money issue here as well, as the US is obviously heading for bankruptcy. So they also needs to cut their cost. And yeah.
Well, we'll see about that one, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and also maybe Donald Trump's personal experiences that some of these NGOs have been turned away from the outside and turned to the inside, and you know how we also know, at least since the church committee, that the security state, the intelligence state, also has been turned not just to the outside but also to the inside against the American people, and that's something the U.S. takes very very serious, right? About using military or military-like force against their own population, which they are supposed to protect. But when it comes to these outside, it's just also so much important to keep in mind that the Europeans too, European populations are very much the target of this, right? And your own experience, I mean, the Ukrainians are one thing, and the Ukrainians, I think what you're adding here is a very important second level to the discussion that also Nikolai Petro has in his books about the internal politics of Ukraine and how big the pressure was in order to then move toward this war, and the pressure on Zelensky in order to turn away from the peace platform. So now we know the NGOs are also part of that puzzle, to kind of whip up policy adherence, which is made in Washington and Brussels, Washington mainly, and not in Kiev. But you yourself too. I mean, inside Europe, you've experienced pressure from these NGOs. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this, how that works?
Sure. Let me just say the first though with the European, because we also do this, and Orban, the Prime Minister of
Mm,
Hungary, recently made this comment as well that you know we all have to transfer money into Brussels, and then Brussels use this to finance NGOs,
mm,
which are financing protests and anti-government activities in our own country. So they're financing essentially activities against to destabilize their own government. This is what the NGOs have done. So he was very much favorable of defunding this. And again, the Indian foreign minister was it Jai Shankar. He was also making this point. Like we don't want all these NGOs. It's not civil society is part of democracy, but we have our civil society is not to be run by the European Union. This is not democracy, and he calling for a distinction between democracy and what we call now liberalism. But no, well, we have the same. Yeah, we have the same in this country. In Norway, we have some of the same actors who who um, who participate. So, for example, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is now being drained of funds by Donald Trump. They're also very active in this country, but it's not for regime change because we have a very
obedient.
obedient government. Yeah, no, they don't dissent much from the United States. Well, now they might actually after the Munich conference, but yeah, they make sure that well they connect themselves very close to the media. So whenever something happens in the international system, any conflicts, the journalists they will go and speak with these NGOs because they they represent freedom and democracy, and so allegedly. So then they get to frame all the issues around the world. So what's happening in China, what's happening in Russia, what's happening, and because they're a human rights organization NGO, they get to frame well in the struggle democracy, and then you have authoritarianism. So every conflict around the world is disseminated to the media as a conflict between good and evil. So of course the Ukraine crisis as well. Obviously, this is of all the complexity, all the main issues which has sparked this conflict and continues it. It's always dumbed down to this idea that well they want freedom and democracy, Russia is evil, and they hate democracy, and this is the narrative. But it's more convincing when it comes from an NGO. So they really immerse themselves with the media. But of course, when you dissent, when you criticize the war, and I have criticized it since 2014, I'm very very critical of how NATO has been and the West has been involved in this, and yeah, pushing the war. Well, what happens then? Then they have to smear, censor, and of course cancel anyone who opposes it. So this one NGO in Norway, it's called Norwegian Helsinki Committee. It's financed by the U.S. government, just the foreign ministry. It's financed by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the CIA cutout from 1983, and it's also financed by my own government. And they write these regular smear pieces in the article where I'm always a Russian propagandist, a Russian agent. I'm in breach of international law because I spoke to a Russian newspaper. It's just yeah, it's just nothing really makes sense. And they sit on their social media, writing tweets all the time, just smearing, not just smearing me, but also the university, because they always put the what do you call it, the not the hashtag, but the link to the university, so they will see that they're smearing them because of me. The implication if I wasn't there, then this wouldn't happen. They also make calls for other academics and colleagues to stand up against me to counter Russian propaganda. they're retweeting and advocating this what do they call it, this Vatnik soup, all this troll online troll army who tries to intimidate and harass people. They send letters to my university. They call the head of my university to, say how problematic I am. Every time I have a speaking event, they try to have it cancelled. If it was like a union and they're not able to get the people organized to cancel, they will encourage people to withdraw from the union in opposition. Everywhere I speak if it's a public event, they go to the organizer, the people attend. Anyways, they do what they can to cancel it. And no, it's become quite extreme to the point, you can imagine I get a lot of hate mails and hate calls, and one of their employees actually posted a picture of my house on the social media as well. So, it's a very vile, very, and all of this is of course under the banner of a human rights NGO, democracy. It's no, it's very dark. So when I see Trump defunding all of this, I can't help but to think, yeah, let it burn. This should be brought down. This has nothing to do with civil society. It's about political propaganda. It's about manufacturing consent, and it's about canceling and censoring any dissenting voices.
Yeah. I am very sorry to hear that you go through all of these horrible experiences yourself in free, democratic, and pluralist Norway, right? Of all places. But it just one thing though, I would like to make to also state that having NGOs in and of itself is a good thing, right? It's a good thing to have civil society and to have organizations, and Reporters Without Borders does important work in order to shed light on the places in which journalists are being shot and killed, although way not enough, for instance, about Gaza, but in other places. No, I think actually in Gaza they did mention that. So it is a good idea to have NGOs that represent the interests of certain groups of civil society. The problem, just like with it's a good idea to have human rights. The problem is when you abuse that in order to create these systems of repression, right? So, do you think that we can do away with the repression and with the control part and societal control and what they call cognitive warfare, right? To use these NGOs in order to target populations and change their views. Can we destroy that while still maintaining the socially useful function of these NGOs?
Well, that's a good question because that's the core of it. Because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Mhm.
Because there are a lot of NGOs who are excellent to do a lot of important work. Because there is a lot of problems and suffering around the world, and the whole concept, indeed, of international civil society, it is one that has some merit to it. That is, if you see people suffering in another country, why? Well, shouldn't there be some common humanity with them? Shouldn't we here? Should we not take an interest and stand with other people in another country if they need assistant help? I mean, there's no reason why national borders should necessarily sever off what is considered to be civil society. So I'm not opposed to, obviously, civil society, not opposed. I think this is immensely important as a check on government power. But my criticism is when governments hijack the representation of NGOs, now of civil society, because civil society is a check on government power. Now, if the government gets to represent civil society, now, yeah, it doesn't
Yeah.
need to explain why this is problematic, but yeah, how do you do this? And I think the main first, there has to be some transparency and honest discussions about this, and not just say any criticism of NGOs is hatred of civil society, because whenever you have concentration of power, you should be concerned. And again, representing civil society, such as NGOs often do, it's a huge power. And then you have to be honest, like, oh, who would want to wield this power? Well, there's some interest group, isn't there? Intelligence agencies, anyone who essentially has a job to manipulate civil society of other countries. So I think it has to be honest there. And it's the same with the think tanks. Once you have these organizations which are, put all the government officials on their payroll, who are able to supply a lot of articles to the media. you should see who's financing them, who was able to influence foreign policy to such an extent to create essentially what we believe to be knowledge, that dictate the narratives. And you find then, of course, who's going to pay for this? Well, then we see it's the main arms manufacturer. So you have to be honest when power concentrates. But again, you don't want to throw out everything. Again, on the think tank issue, one of the main uh, organizations writing about the destructive influence of think tanks is a think tank, the Responsible Statecraft. So you can't just cancel all of them. So how do you how do you split the good one from the bad ones? I think you can't have ones. It has to be some, I guess, transparency around the financing. I think this has to be it. And uh, yeah, when you have government financing NGOs and working with intelligence agencies and then pursuing national or geopolitical interests. Um, I think then it should be quite obvious that civil society is not being assisted, that is not being elevated. I think then it's being controlled.
Yeah.
And but how do you do this? I think that's an excellent question. And
But I think this is absolutely right. Transparency about the money flows. So make it clear, and not just for the NGOs, make it clear how things are running on the economic side, because you only have basically two base models, right? One is you receive money in order to do what you do from some other source, or the thing that you do is what you sell, which is finances yourself, which is how the private sector usually works, right? And there we need to be transparent as well. I mean, just an example, YouTube. You and I, we are able to receive money from what we do, not because somebody externally pays us, but because we deliver eyeballs to YouTube, right? And YouTube serves these eyeballs to the advertisers. And advertisers pay YouTube, and YouTube gives us a share of that money, right? That's the model. That's what allows it to do. So YouTube is not actually it's not a video sharing platform. YouTube is a eyeball delivery platform for advertisers, right? And we are engaged in that. But that then allows us to do what we do, and as long as we deliver the eyeballs, then we can continue doing this. Um, in the NGO sector, it works differently. Although some NGOs they sell the product, right, that they deliver. And if we make that clear, that would create the transparency and the honesty about what's going on. That would give enough information to viewers and to readers to understand what system they're engaged in.
no, I think that's that's important because a key challenge is when you allow society to become effectively an appendage of the market and not to the sidetrack to the think tanks, but actually the director of the Kennan Institute, which is also a think tank, he was also making this point, which is, we have to be honest. Where the money comes from, because if it's like the YouTube model you have, it becomes very unproblematic. But he said what we're essentially doing is we become peddlers of influence. So so this is all we do. And in the NGO area, uh, yeah, this is also what you do. You're effectively putting civil society for sale, and it's only one buyer, uh, which is the main governments, intelligence agencies. But it's also this, I guess a fair rule would be, and it might be easier now that the world becomes more multipolar, because I think it's a reason why these NGOs ran a bit rampant over the past 30 years when all power was concentrated in the West, because in a multipolar system, it suggests that others will also be able to do this. So a good rule would be to think, what if other countries will do this? Would we accept it? Let's say China, Russia, or another country we're being told to hate would pump, billions of dollars into non-governmental organizations, and these NGOs, of course, would work with their security services, and all human rights would be, because they are human rights. Whatever is good for us is good for human rights. So it's a way of promoting their policy directly throughout the people's public. Would we accept this? And I think it's quite obvious no, of course not. We would consider this hybrid war. We would say it's an attack on democracy. But what is it? What exactly is different when we do it? And we always go back to the same things. Well, we are democracy, so it's okay when we do it, but not others. But this is why it was fascinating to listen to the Indian foreign minister at the Munich conference, because they are the largest democracy in the world, and he was making kind of the same argument that, like, who are these self-appointed custodians of democracy? They're coming from the West. They have no democratic legitimacy in India, yet they demand to interfere and tell everyone what to do, and even start to get organize themselves and manipulate, because there's a lot of not sorry, there's a lot of NGOs financed by the West in India. And he made this great comment, which everyone should watch in his speech, where he said, if India would do in your countries what you do in our country, you would be up in arms. You would never tolerate this. And this comes from India, again, the world's largest democracy, a country we're not supposed to hate, which is seen to be a friendly country. So what would we say if it was the Chinese or the Russians who did this to us? Under no circumstance would that be acceptable. So why is it that when they talk about NGO laws in countries like Georgia, we we only have to dismiss it as, oh, this is Putin laws, and then we have to remove the government, otherwise they will abandon democracy, because yeah, this is democracy apparently, to have Western governments finance your civil society. There's no honest debate. I think if we were allowed to discuss things, to have debates, I think it would be very different. But we don't. We have the slogans, as we spoke about before. If you for transparency on NGOs, which was the law the Georgians pushed, then you're having Putin laws, and this is evil. So you have to let the NGOs from the West, that is not from Russia, do what they want. Otherwise, yeah, you're evil.
That's how simplified reality can be, and this is what we have to oppose. We need to recognize the complexities of it all, and one of the people who helps us a lot to recognize complexity is Glenn Diesen from Norway, and you have your own YouTube channel, you have your own Substack, and the links will be in the description. I encourage everybody subscribe to Glenn. He delivers fantastic analysis and he does wonderful talks as well. Anything you would like to add at this point where people should find you?
No, mostly, yeah, Substack or YouTube or Twitter, or X is called now. Sorry.
Right.
So yeah,
Twitter X as well. He has a big followership there as well. Glenn Deason, thank you very much for your time today.
thank you, Pascal.